Welcome to Project HeadCanon. This is the 20th video of the Content Crosshair series, in which we closely examine specific pieces of Star Wars media to determine their canonicity within the project. Today, we're going over one of the very first things ever published as part of the Star Wars franchise, the 1978 novel written by Alan Dean Foster, titled Splinter of the Mind's Eye. In 2 ABY, while en route to a meeting with some potential new members of the Rebel Alliance, Luke and Leia, accompanied by R2-D2 and C-3PO, crash land on Mimban. They journey through the swamps and come across a mining town under Imperial occupation. At a cantina, they meet Hala, an old woman with some force sensitivity, who agrees to help them escape the planet if they help her locate an ancient force artifact called the Kyber Crystal. Luke and Leia get into an argument, which leads to them being captured and brought before Grammel, supervisor of the Imperial occupation. After a brief interrogation, they're thrown in jail alongside 2 Yuzem. Luke knows the Yuzem language, and with some outside force help from Hala, they manage to escape and steal a wheeled transport to seek the Kyber crystal. In the swamps, they encounter a Wandrella, which damages their vehicle. Luke and Leia are separated from the others and end up in a vast network of caves and subterranean waterways. They eventually stumble upon an underground city inhabited by a sentient species called the Koei, who had captured Hala, the droids, and the 2 Yuzem. Luke wins a trial by combat to secure his companion's release and the Koei's friendship. Then Darth Vader arrives, and the Empire invades the Koei's cave system with a few dozen stormtroopers. The heroes join the Koei in ambushing the Imperials. A small battle takes place, during which Leia shoots Darth Vader with a blaster rifle, injuring him. The Imperials leave the caves to regroup, and Vader executes Supervisor Grammel for his incompetence. The 2 Yuzem hijack an Imperial transport, and the heroes race Vader to the location of the Kyber crystal, a large ancient temple. Arriving first, Luke and his companions encounter a Hessis. Luke collapses the temple's roof on it, but is himself trapped under the rubble. Vader arrives, and Leia engages him in a lightsaber duel, while Hala recovers the Kyber crystal and a Yuzem frees Luke. Vader defeats Leia, but Luke takes up his lightsaber to continue the fight. He eventually cuts off Vader's right arm, and then Vader falls down a bottomless pit, though he does survive. Hala gives the Kyber crystal to Luke, and he uses it to heal himself and Leia. Then they all leave the temple. The end. I actually think this is a decent book on its own merits. The worst I can say about the writing is that the dialogue is a bit stilted. But the story flows well, and the plot makes logical sense. Basically, it's as close to a default Star Wars story as you can get. Good guys on the run, a mysterious local ally, complacent bad guy bureaucracy, the threat of the Sith looming in the background, primitive indigenes overcoming technologically superior invaders, and a lightsaber duel to cap it all off. All the familiar themes and tropes are there. But the most important thing to keep in mind is that this book came out before The Empire Strikes Back. In fact, it was being written before Star Wars even released, and it was originally meant to be a low-budget sequel, to be adapted into a film if making a full-blown Episode 5 turned out to not be feasible. That counterfactual basis for its creation translates to a counterfactual framing within the broader context of Star Wars lore. As the original trilogy crystallized, Star Wars grew in a different direction. Apart from the skeleton of plot and theme, it's tough to find anything consistent between this novel and pretty much any other writing in Star Wars. Luke in this novel is more cynical than he is naive. Leia is more princess than freedom fighter, seemingly allergic to getting her hands dirty. And that's to say nothing of the decidedly non-fraternal dynamic between them. Han and Chewie aren't even in it, because Harrison Ford hadn't signed on to appear in any sequels to Star Wars yet. However, the biggest blow to its credibility as a Star Wars story is the final duel between Luke, Leia, and Vader. I highly doubt Vader would fail to recognize his own last name, let alone the force signatures of his 2 children, or fail to mention the truth of their relationship during their duel, or indeed get injured by either of these 2 relative amateurs in a duel. It is vitally important that the confrontation between Luke and Vader in Episode 5 is the first time they ever meet face-to-face, to say nothing of the current score being 1-0 in favor of Luke at that point. The struggle and relationship between Luke and Vader is at the very core of what Star Wars is. That significance borders on the theological, and I am not willing to let anything undermine it. That said, a few small world-building details do make frequent appearances in later media. The planet Mimban appears in Solo: A Star Wars Story, along with a sentient species that superficially resembles the Koei. Pieces of the Kyber crystal turn up in KOTOR 2 and The Force Unleashed, among other places. But for our purposes, that just means we won't lose out on those details, even if we do end up cutting this book entirely. Speaking of which, Splinter of the Mind's Eye is a decent book in isolation, and an interesting counterfactual within Star Wars, but the franchise quickly evolved to render it obsolete, and forcing it to remain would undermine too much for no appreciable benefit. So, I hereby declare Splinter of the Mind's Eye to be entirely non-canon within the project. The cutting process proved relatively simple, as its story is pretty self-contained. Some work has been done in the expanded universe to attempt to tie the novel into the rest of Star Wars, notably including a book called The Rise and Fall of Darth Vader. But fortunately, none of those attempts succeeded enough to make my life too difficult here. There is a comic series that tells the same story, which is where I got some of the images in this video. Though it does include a few details to better fit with Episode 5, I decided to cut it alongside its novel counterpart. In total, I only ended up deleting 126 articles, including 46 files, and making 413 other edits to the wiki. This result was something of a foregone conclusion. I've had my eye on cutting Splinter of the Mind's Eye for a while now, and this felt like as good a time as any to finally do it. In the next video, we'll visit another comic series, this one a bit more controversial than the last. Until then, may the Force be with you.